Now, before we go to the implementation side, in order to get remote access to a device for device administration, the most commonly used protocols are Telnet and SSH. HTTP and HTTPS can also be used only if, of course, the device that you're trying to access has a rich GUI, in which you can find all features configurable from the GUI. But this is not the use case for CISCO routers, switches. For firewalls, yes, but for CISCO routers and switches, the GUI offers a very limited set of features. So using HTTP and HTTPS doesn't work. It used to be that CISCO offered a client, like it's ASDM for ASA. For routers was SDM, and then CISCO Configuration Professional in order to connect to the router, and you used to have pretty much a lot of features available from the GUI. But because CCP or Cisco Configuration Professional and SDM are no longer in the blueprint, my guess is that Cisco is going to try and go away from those tools, because probably nobody really used those to begin with at all. Now, Telnet versus SSH, clearly Telnet is a clear text protocol, so everything sent back and forth between the user and the router is going to be in clear text, including the username and password, so that is bad. While SSH, Secure Shell, offers built-in encryption. That's why it's called Secure Shell. So SSH offers you secure access to a shell of a device. Plain simple again, right? Telnet supports both. Another difference is that Telnet supports both password and username and password authentication, while SSH requires only username and password based authentication. SSH can also make use of public-private keys, but it's outside of the scope of CCNA blueprint. Telnet is enabled by default, SSH not, because in order for SSH to provide encryption of the packet, so whatever the SSH payload, so all of the commands that you type in an SSH session, and also the username and password you're going to use to authenticate to a router, all of that traffic is being encrypted, so nobody can actually sniff the packet and identify the username and password, while in Telnet they can do that. So in order for SSH to actually provide that security level, it has to generate it's going to make use of what is called a RSA public-private key pair, which has to be generated. But for the key pair to be generated, most iOS codes require the network device to have a host name and a domain name configured, because those values are going to be used in the generation of the RSA key pair. Newer codes no longer require the domain name to be configured, just the host name. So it may depend on the iOS version you're trying to test on. So we're going to configure things in step as follows. So on test PCA, there's nothing to configure. I'm going to use a client to connect to the router via Telnet or SSH. Nothing to configure at all. It means I got to go on router 3 and configure AAA. And then go on ACS1 and configure the TACACS Plus integration with the router, and also configure, if we have to, and we're going to see exactly what, configure AAA as well. Now let's take it one by one. So I'm going to use, from the authentication point of view on router 3, from the authentication point of view, I'm going to use TACACS Plus as the primary method. And in case TACACS Plus server fails, I'm going to fall back on the local database of users. So for this example, I'm going to configure on ACS1 a username of TACACS with a password of TACACS, and on router 3 a username of local with a password of local for fallback access. So let's go and just do the authentication part. Let's go on router 3. Let's make sure I can ping the ACS server. Ping, that's going to be an IP address of 172.16.1.100. Ping 172.16.1.100. Okay. So first of all, a new model. Then I'm going to say AAA authentication login. And I'm not going to use the default list because this also applies to the console. I don't want that. I'm going to say login VTI authentication. Group TACACS Plus with fallback on local database. I want to configure that username of local. I want to assign him a privilege level of, let's say, 10 and a password of local. Then I want to define the TACACS Plus configuration. TACACS Plus server host 172.16.1.100 key 1.100 key, let's say TACACS key. So this key has to match identically also on the TACACS server. And optionally I can define the source of the TACACS packet, because when VARATV is going to send that TACACS packet towards the ACS server, it has to put a source IP address because the destination is going to be the ACS's IP address. So by default, as routing works, looking at my network, if we say on if we look on VARATV and say how can I reach the TACACS server, so do show IP route TACACS server, because it's routable out on this interface, then the router is gonna make use of the IP address of that interface, of the egress interface towards the TACACS server as the source IP address of the TACACS packet. It's gonna make use of this. In certain use cases, because of redundant paths, you may want to configure the router so that it's always gonna source the TACACS packets from a loopback. That's going to make sure that it doesn't matter what is the physical path towards the TACACS server, the TACACS packets will always be sourced with the same IP address. It's important to do this because on the TACACS server, on the ACA server, you're going to define a router tree as an IP address, as a name and IP address, and the IP address has to match with the source IP address that VARATV is going to use to generate TACACS packets towards the ACA server. So I have defined the TACACS server, both the source and the key, defined the local username, and defined the authentication list. And now because that's non-default list, I got to apply that on the VTI lines, if I want it to be enforced. So I'm going to say line VTI 04 login authentication and the list name of that, and there we go. So pretty much I'm done on VARATV from the authentication point of view. Let's go on the ACS server and configure also the ACS server now. I'm gonna go into SPCA. Okay, let me view authenticate. Let's open up Internet Explorer and browse to the HTTPS address of ACS. Not 3 but 1. While this loads up, there is a question from Alex saying, I can also configure a TACACS server by the command TACACS server name. Is there any difference configuring it this way? Yes, it is. So for example, you have currently three, let me think if it's 2 or 4 methods. So you have the A group and the TACACS server. You have 3 methods to define a TACACS server or a radius server on a router. And based on which way you define the attack server, then you have specific options from the attack server configuration point of view, or you have, let's say, you have better redundancy from the configuration point of view of the attack server. So it depends what you want to achieve. But to answer your question, if there is any difference if you configure the attack server by the command attack server name, for what I want to do at this point, only provide basic AAA, there is no difference at all. But of course, if you would want to provide like redundancy at the attack server level via putting those attack servers into groups, because the redundancy is different if you put attack servers into what is called AA groups, rather than defining all of them globally as I did with the attack server command. So it depends what you want to achieve, as I was saying, but for regular AA, like basic AA authentication, accounting, and authorization, each of those methods is going to work. But ideally, you're not going to use this old method, because CISCO is going to go away from this configuration options, because that was the first available option on the devices, the one that I'm using. And of course, there is one more difference, because depending on how you define the attack server, if you look in here on the configuration, if you put in the AA authentication login and then you put in question mark, then when you say group, of course, if you have defined AttackAx or radio server as I did globally, then you're going to put in here group AttackAx plus. But if you have defined the server as you're saying with the AttackAx server name command, where that attack server name is going to be called under a AAA server group. So the configuration you're looking for with the attack server name command, it cannot work by itself. You have to call in that identity, that name of the attack server, into a AA group. I'm going to show you in a couple. But either way, if you use that configuration option, then you have to define in here not group attack plus or radius, but group and the name of the group you have defined on your attack server. So there is a difference from the configuration point of view, but from the functional point of view, not really for basic AA configuration. I think I have gone also back and forth with this type of configuration, with the global configuration and AA group specific configuration. I think I have done this in the security bootcamp class. I'm not 100% sure though. So I would love to show you all of those examples, but unfortunately there's no time in a 4 or 5 days class, which is also what a regular CISCO CCNA class is, like a 4 or 5 days. Is not enough time to cover all of the options. Because the scope of the CCNA class in general, whatever the track is just to give you a brief introduction to a lot of technologies. But of course, that doesn't mean you should not ask questions. So ask as many questions as you want. I highly encourage that. But I'm not going to have time to show you that up on the CLI everything, all options, because we're going to get tracked. We're going to get behind, and we have to cover up pretty much all of the topics which are relevant for the blueprint. ACS admin and then default 1A. Okay, so here the first step is to, number one, let's say go under users and identity stores, users, and configure that username of TACAX, because I want to authenticate router access via TACAX. And I'm going to use the local user database in here. Name is going to be, the username is going to be TACAX, as I was saying, and then the password likewise TACAX. And say submit. Then you go to network resources and you define the configuration of TACAX. You configure ACS to speak TACAX with the router. So it makes sense it's under network resources, because I'm going to put in here a network device or the NAT. So this I'm going to put in here the integration with network devices or network access devices. Create. There's going to be a name of router 3. IP address is going to be, let's see what is the loopback of router 3, because I have configured to source TACACS packets with the loopback address. Do show run interface loopback 0. To confirm this is going to be working from the routing point of view, let's say do ping 172.16.100 the source of loopback 0. So as long as ICMP traffic is allowed back and forth, this confirms that I have IP connectivity between the source of the TACACS packet to the TACACS server. So that's going to confirm bidirectional routing connectivity. So IP address is going to be 110.333. And then it's going to be, this is going to be only for TACACS. I don't care about radius. I'm going to say TACACS. And the share secret was TACACS key. Let's confirm that. Do show run include TACACS. TACACS key. Okay, let's put in here TACACS key. And let's say submit. Okay, let's see why this is, looks like it's stuck, the GUI. Let's try to submit again. So probably it has managed to add it, but it kept me in the, it's not there. Let's do create again. So there was a bug in the GUI. Let's define it again. Router 3 10.333. No radius, just TACACS, and put in there the shared string between the router and the TACACS server, which was TACACS key. There we go. So I've defined the router as a TACACS client. I've configured the username and password that the supplicant test PCA is going to use to authenticate on the router via TACACS. Next, I gotta make sure that access policies. So I gotta make sure that the ACS server has access policies to allow for the authentication to happen. You go on the default device admin. So all TACACS plus requests are going to be parsed as configured in the default device admin. Identity means that I'm going to authenticate any TACACS plus requests against the internal user's database, and that's correct. That's what I want. And then from the authorization point of view, for the moment, I don't want to provide any kind of authorization, but because so I don't want to provide any kind of authorizations, but in here, actually, this is a bit misleading, because in the authorization tab in here, I'm going to define authentication lists. I'm going to define. Let me try to come up with a better explanation. So what happens is, as I was saying, by default, all incoming TACACS requests will go under default device admin access services rules, which means the ACS server is going to try to authenticate the TACACS request as configured in the identity section, which means against the internal user database. But then to reply to the router saying yes, credentials are valid or not valid, I need to match an entry in the authorization section. So I need here to match a list, a configure authorization list, even if I don't configure yet any kind of authorizations. And by default, I have one, which is permit access. So I have a default list which says permit access. So it's going to return back no authorizations at all, but it is going to just allow access as long as, of course, the credentials typed in by the user have been correct. So before we turn it in, let's go on the router and say test A group, test A group TACAX plus, username TACAX, password TACAX, legacy. There we go, it says user was successfully authenticated. So now, like if I'm gonna go on router 1, for example, and try and turn it to router 3, I should be authenticating via the TACAX plus server. TACAX is the user and TACAX is the password. There you go, I got authenticated and I got access to the router as expected. Now the problem is that the current privilege level being assigned to me, show privilege, it is 1. This is the default privilege level which is going to be assigned to the user in case there has been no kind of exec authorization being configured, which I have not configured any kind of exec authorizations on router 3. So let's go ahead and also do exec authorization at this point. Before we do that, we can go to monitoring and reports and go to launch monitoring and report viewer, and let's look at the logs of ACS to confirm that I should see in here 2 entries, 2 successful authentications being performed by the same user of TACAX, one by the test simulation and one by the actual telnet session from router 1 to router 3. There we go. You see exactly 2 green entries for the username of TACAX, which means in both cases authentication was successful, as we know.